If you asked people what the biggest stores of all time are, most wouldn't think of Woolworth being close to the top. We've all heard the name, but many don't know how big of a deal they were in their time. Growing to numbers unheard of in its day, the Five and Dime was once the biggest retailer in the world. I'm going to focus on the original American Woolworth. They had a ton of subsidiaries, and many companies are named after them. From nickels to billions, this is the history of F.W. Woolworth. This video was voted for by the viewers. If you'd like to vote for the next episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. On with the show. In circa 1800s Watertown, New York was a wholesale and dry goods retailer called Augsbury and Moore, a flagship of the city. They had a young sales clerk, previously in their apprenticeship for the last few years. That young man was Frank Winfield Woolworth. The company was in an awkward position. They had a hefty debt, but at the same time had a lot of unsold merchandise. This led him to hold a sale where they marked a lot of these goods at just 5 cents. The sale was a huge hit, and it gave Woolworth an idea. What if someone sold all their goods at that price, not just as a sale, but as a fully fledged retail model, always 5 cents? 3 years later, with a loan from Moore, Woolworth opened just that type of store in Utica, a variety store called the Great 5 Cent Store. Unfortunately, it didn't last long, but then he opened another in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He fixed mistakes learned from Utica, and this time the format was a success. This store changed names twice, first to 5 and 10 when he added 10-cent items, and finally to simply Woolworths. At the same time, prices were dropping on wholesale products. There were more lower-priced goods than ever. The 5 and dime concept was now even more profitable, and Frank wanted to open more of them. He and his brother, Charles Sumner Woolworth, opened a second location in Harrisburg called the 5-cent Woolworth Brothers store. The first Woolworths were kind of trial and error. No one had done the 5 and dime format before, so they were pioneering a new industry at the same time as inventing new management, buying, and selling techniques. Like franchisees of today, partners owned the stores. Some included his brother, his cousin, and his old boss William Moore. Over time, they began opening new stores independently of Frank, which quickly grew the chain. Soon, they opened their first Canadian store in Toronto. A salesman that frequented Woolworth was a man named Sebastian Spearing Kresge. He decided to invest the money he saved up from selling to open his own 5 and dime in Memphis. His partner was a former customer of his, named John McCrory. After a couple of years, they went their separate ways. Each would grow their respective chains into legendary status. By 1900, there were 59 Woolworths, and sales hit $5 million. During the turn of the century, company growth was faster than ever, and a lot of new openings came from acquisitions of smaller chains. In 1909, 3 of his employees were moved to England, where they started the first 3 and 6 pence stores. Also, in Furtschegger, Germany, they opened a warehouse for overseas buying. Foreign goods would be a big selling point for their stores. By now, their stores and sales had doubled. Woolworth didn't just revolutionize with the 5 and dime. He was big on letting customers browse the stores, even if they didn't spend any money. Instead of needing to ask for products from behind a counter, Woolworth had them out on display at a set price. This was all uncommon back then, but Woolworth popularized it. They had a lot of buying power. Everybody wanted their products sold at Woolworth, and they custom-tailored their inventories based on local taste. On top of competition from the growing SS Kresge and McCrory stores, his partners had their own chains. In this fierce competition, Frank hatched a plan. In 1912, he and his partners merged their 6 chains together. The new F.W. Woolworth Company had nearly 600 stores, more than any other chain in America. These numbers were unheard of at the time. Next year, the $13.5 million 60-story Woolworth building was finished in New York City, which held the company offices. When it was completed, it was the tallest building in the world. On April 8, 1919, Frank Woolworth died at 66. He'd taken on a lot more stressful duties at the company, and the work finally caught up with him. He had an unbridled passion for retail that made F.W. Woolworth what it was, and his passing didn't change that. His brother took over some duties but declined the presidency. He was a modest man and found joy in guiding the company from behind the scenes. By 1929, Woolworth's 50th anniversary, they had 2,247 stores throughout 5 countries. Woolworths served 10 million customers and made $1 million every single day. Some days, it was estimated that 1 in 5 of the entire population of the country visited a Woolworths store. The Great Depression was the first drop in sales since the 1880s. After the Depression, sales were rising again. However, during World War II, tensions were again at a high. Not only did this mark another fall in sales, but nearly half their male employees entered the army. During the war, nearly a fourth of their stores had female managers. With the end of the war came surplus, not only in supplies and manpower, but also competition. Woolworth didn't adapt well to the changing American culture. There was an onslaught of discounters and supermarkets. There were also more shopping centers being built than ever before. They were outdated. Their stores needed remodels, product lines needed a once-over, and they had to incorporate the self-service customers wanted. In 1954, James Leftwich stepped up as president. He directed over $100 million to renovations in all of Woolworth's markets. Woolworth hit its stride under his successor, Robert Kirkwood. He oversaw the openings of over 1,000 stores. In 1960, Woolworth's sales passed $1 billion. Their lunch counters fed 750,000 people every day, second only to the armed forces. That February was the start of the famous Greensboro sit-ins. After being refused service at Woolworths, 4 black students sat down at their lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, in an effort to end the company's segregation policies. They were heckled, threatened, and ignored, but they persisted. The next day, there were over 20 students. Then there were 60, then 300. This continued until more than 1,000 people were squeezed into the small store. Despite even President Eisenhower showing his support, Woolworth HQ refused to change the policy. It wasn't until after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Woolworth was fully desegregated. What followed was an age of diversification for Five and Dimers. In 1962, Kresge opened Kmart, one of the first Five and Dimes to enter the world of discount department stores. Woolworth also entered discount, with a new subsidiary called Woolco. By just 3 years later, there were 17 Woolcos. Kirkwood's last big hurrah was the purchase of Kinney Shoes, which had over 500 stores and also manufactured shoes. Kirkwood wasn't a perfect executive, but history would show that he may have been the last person who could run the impossible empire Woolworth had become. In the 70s, Woolworth began to lose their status. Kresge's 1972 sales outperformed them by $1 billion. This was because of Kmart, which had already proven itself to be an unstoppable retail machine, with 500 stores alone. So what was with Woolco? Well, they failed to diversify themselves from their contemporaries. Its company image was poorly established, and this made it harder for them to compete. Kinney opened Foot Locker in 1974, a chain that would later prove key to the survival of Woolworth. By the 80s, Woolco had grown to over 400 stores between the US and Canada, but its problems persisted. Their stores were opened with a debt, so when the time came for Woolworth to pay it off, they couldn't. They closed all US Woolco operations in 1983. Also, they sold off their British division. Foot Locker was an enormous success, as was its new sister chains, Lady and Kids Foot Locker. Through the rest of the 80s, management pushed Woolworth heavily into more specialty retail and mall development. They were spread too thin and didn't have enough money to compete. This made them focus less on the increasingly aging Woolworth stores, as most money was going elsewhere. McCrory's was in a similar, much worse off ship. They were still focused on the variety store format, with 1,300 stores under the names of McCrory, TG&Y, and JJ Newberry. McCrory filed for bankruptcy in 1992, setting off a chain of closures. By just a decade later, all their brands were gone. Quickly, Woolworth had been run into the ground. They became cash-strapped in just a few years, at the same time racking up a debt of $800 million. In management's eyes, the problem was their general merchandise stores, specifically the original Woolworths. The five and dime model didn't make sense in a climate dominated by discount. 1993 reported a loss of nearly $500 million. That's where it gets interesting. Several lawsuits were filed against Woolworth, claiming they falsified those reports. This would make one think their situation was much worse than they were selling it. Their CEO was forced out, and former Macy's president Roger Farah took his place. Insiders were pushing him to spin off their athletic chains, but Farah refused to give up on the parent. He reinvented Woolworth stores to be a little trendier, carrying less variety and more everyday goods. Despite changes, Woolworth's bottom line was still in the red, and they were destitute. They couldn't take any more losses, so they cut the whole chain. All their 400 remaining five and dimes in the US would cease operation. F.W. Woolworth was renamed the Venator Group, leading a full focus on specialty retail. In 2001, they rebranded as Foot Locker Incorporated, an exclusively athletic retailer. Frank and his partners were a powerhouse that built up much of what the company was for most of its existence. I believe discount was their ticket to future relevancy. Five and dimes didn't have much more time left. Look at Kmart, who smartly closed all their five and dimes by the mid-90s. Woolco wasn't set up correctly, and ultimately took the main company down with it. Farah did a lot to rejuvenate Woolworth, but sadly he didn't come soon enough. They were one of the most influential and legendary retail chains in world history, all under a name so powerful it's still used to this day.